First point of order is air conditioning is obviously being run by Qantas. So anyone who wants to take their tie off like me, please do. Roll up your sleeves. Let's be comfortable about it. It's not going to get any cooler, I don't think. Always a pleasure to come back to Australia, first of all, because I don't have to apologise to the translators for speaking too quickly and too long. Simultaneous translation is a bit of a problem when you speak at the speed I do and with the accent that I have, which has been unanimously voted the worst amongst all the IEA countries. Great honour. The second good thing about coming back here is, of course, you get to read the Australian press, the Telegraph and so on, which is just tremendously informative. And one thing I did definitely learn to avoid is rhetorical flourishes. I think that was my first lesson in Australian when I came back. Ken's given me an obscene amount of time to summarise a 700-page book, which, as you can see, weighs about 1.5 kilos. It's great when you travel. It's good for bicep curls and all kinds of useful things. I'll apologise in advance. One of my French bosses described my presentation style as an avalanche des chiffres. If you speak French, you know it means basically an avalanche of figures. There will be plenty of math. Sorry, Professor Chu. Lots and lots of math. Quick overview. In the time allotted, I want to try and cover the 6 topics. A short introduction to what the IEA is and the World Energy Outlook, in particular the WEO, as we affectionately call it. A quick burst on oil, rather uninteresting market, I think, but not. And then to talk about electricity markets, and I think we've already this morning talked a lot about the fact that electricity has to be the focus of decarbonisation. It's the way we'll be able to get transport sector decarbonised, and of course the sector itself has to decarbonise, so renewables and nuclear power will be part of that. I then want to talk about the big 4 power markets: US, China, EU and India, most interesting ones. Gas, coal and energy trade, that might be a bit more interesting to this audience than some other places I go to. And then finally some thoughts on energy investment, which will draw on the book that we produced earlier in the year. So a quick introduction. The IEA is now 40 years old. It was founded by a certain Dr. Kissinger back 40 years ago. Fairly popular lad with the aid of some Europeans. Its founding raison d'etre was oil security, but increasingly, of course, oil security has had to be broadened to include gas security and electricity security. And of course, security is but one part of a trilemma, if you like, of affordability. If you're a Christian Democrat, you say competitiveness, but if you're a Social Democrat, you say affordability and environmental impact. So those 3 aspects of energy policy are continually being balanced, one getting continually a little bit more emphasis than the other, depending on the circumstances of the day. The World Energy Outlook has 3 major scenarios. The first is the current policy scenario, the business as usual case. The third one there, the 450 scenario, is a reverse engineered scenario where we attempt to try and say to the world, what do we need to do to keep climate change to the 2-degree level, 450 parts per million CO2. And the middle scenario, the NPS, or so-called new policy scenario, is our central scenario and our key scenario. We try to anticipate policy directions by looking at recent announced policies, announced but not yet implemented, of which the 2, obviously the most important this year, were the US moves to decarbonise their power sector. And as Secretary Chu, sorry I'm showing my age, Professor Chu pointed out, the administration has had to be very creative, given it has no chance of getting anything much through Congress. We'll talk a little bit about that when we come to the power sector and to coal. And of course China, the announcements, very aggressive announcements by President Xi to address air pollution and to diversify their electricity sector in particular, but their energy sector overall. The Chinese are definitely concerned about both conventional pollution and security in the broader sense. Final point concerns why we do these projections. When I first did one of these, actually it was in China about 10 years ago, and a bright young Chinese lad piped up and said, do you honestly, I can't do his accent, do you honestly believe these projections will happen, will come to pass? And my immediate reaction was to say something jocular like, well, forecasting is designed to give astrology a good name, and the last 10 years have been pretty humbling, but the correct answer, and the one I gave him, was I sincerely hope not, because their objective here is to inform, when all these policies are implemented, what sort of world do we have? And the world we have is a world that we project, and as Professor Lowe pointed out, the world where we have climate change of 3.6 degrees, not a place I want to be, but we also have insecure oil, gas and electricity supplies, and one, we can't afford them either. So, some key results. Total energy use grows 37% to 2040, that's a target year, and you might think that seems a lot, but certainly the last 10 years, and it assumes a considerable, although probably some might say an underestimated amount of energy efficiency. All fossil fuels grow in that scenario, and gas is the fastest. Coal grows, we'll start with oil. Oil grows about 15% from memory, but of course we see a different geographical spread. We see oil use in OECD. Interestingly enough, last year OECD and non-OECD oil roughly 50-50. Non-OECD just passed OECD in oil use 2013. And in the case of gas, it happened back in about 2006, and coal was way back in the 90s. So we see fossil fuels growing, but we see oil growth in non-OECD countries, two reversed. Coal grows about 16 to 18%, but almost all of that's in the next 10 years, after which we start to see it plateau. Gas grows the fastest, by around about 50%. But modern renewables in the power sector grow fastest of all. And when we come to it in a moment, you'll see they overtake coal right near the end of the forecast period. So by 2040, you've got a world where roughly a quarter of each of those energy sources is in the mix. Now you might think that's 75% of fossil fuels. Currently the share of fossil fuels is 82%. So you might think that's not much of an improvement when you look back 25 years to when and I did look back 25 years because I remembered in my tiny little archival brain that looking back 25 years, the share of fossil fuel energy, 82% now, back 25 years was 82%. So we've seen absolutely no change in that the last 25 years. So forecasting that has a certain amount of courage about it. My point about growth come from developing Asia and obviously China and India I'll talk a fair bit about. Energy trade grows in oil and gas and coal, but of course it reflects the shifting geography out of the Atlantic basin into the Pacific, into Asia. I think in Europe I have to spend a lot of time explaining that, but hopefully in this place I don't. And finally, of course, energy-related emissions grow by a fifth. Well, not such a bad result, you might say, given that energy is nearly 40, but of course this is not a 2-degree world, this is a 3.6 degree world. Key message to policymakers: must try harder. We don't say that in the WEO, but hopefully people can read between the lines. So, the global energy system is under stress. Now, you might think, well, gee, that seems a bit odd. Oil's down to $63 this morning. Everything's going hunky-dory. Sydney Telegraph tells me New South Wales motorists are saving $4 million a day, so that must be right. Savings don't seem to have made it to Canberra yet, but anyway, that's another story. Probably most of you people ride bicycles, I suppose. What worries us is that inevitably the Middle East must be the focus of oil supply in the future, in the medium to longer term, and of course the current situation in the Middle East is not conducive to long-term investment, most of all in Iraq. I think we've continue to be surprised the fact that oil continues to come out of places like Libya and Iraq. Our monthly oil market review, which you can download off the web a few days after it's published, has talked consistently about how oil supply has held up while demands continue to be quite weak. Of course, after a couple of trial runs in 2006 and 2009, Europe's finally got the message that their gas supply might not be as secure as they like. And of course, we talked a lot about renewables last week and today as well. Within Europe, generating backup generation is either gas or coal, and if your gas is coming from Russia, well, you may have an issue. In 2009, despite the fact that Europe did have plenty of LNG, lots of options, plenty of storage, still there were places that had no gas because the internal market in Europe doesn't work both for electricity and for gas. Okay, well, next year we have a climate summit in Paris, a fairly important one. Well, when I say Paris, it's out in Le Bourget, which is out near Charles de Gaulle Airport, but it is an important conference. We'll be writing a major report prior to that in June next year. Some things, well, global CO2 emissions are still rising. The only places we've seen falls worthy of talking about the United States, interestingly enough, not famous for its greenhouse policy, with respect to Secretary Chu. You don't think of it's the top rank of a well-developed greenhouse policy. Europe's managed small reductions. We're talking 1%. Given its economic issues, they're actually quite small reductions, and I'll talk about that. Everywhere else, emissions are growing. Fossil fuel subsidies, we spend a lot of time assessing these. We take a very conservative view on subsidies. We don't consider a subsidy, for example, where gasoline and diesel are priced differently, as for example they are in some applications in Australia or indeed in Europe. If you do go to Europe, you'll know that diesel is quite a bit cheaper than gasoline. One of the beneficial effects of that is now Paris has a pollution problem of some dimension because of diesel particulates, not quite in the Beijing category, but enough to cause them some very severe issues. $550 billion, $500 billion, has massive impacts on energy use, efficiency, deployment of renewables. We talk about countries rich in renewables. Saudi Arabia, no one's mentioned Saudi Arabia. You know, what do they use in their power sector? Gas and oil, heavily subsidised and not very efficiently used, I might add. The good news is there are some good signs, increasing emphasis on energy efficiency. Again, the United States showing the way here, and Professor Chu spent a lot of time talking about increased production. There's a demand side story as well. US oil peaked about 2004-05. Okay, the recession's accentuated that. There'll be a little bit of a bounce back. Over the forecast period, we can see the US using more than 4 million barrels per day less than currently. 4 million barrels less. That's a big number. It's more than Iraq's oil production. Similarly, if you went to the Paris Motor Show last month, as I did, apart from the Tesla, the electric vehicles were a sensation, but I think the real sensation was cars that are doing 2 litres per 100 kilometres. Conventional gasoline vehicles, okay, small, whatever. Sorry, Professor Chu, about 120 miles per gallon, a US gallon. This is pretty flash engineering, got everyone very excited. Of course, when the gasoline price and the diesel price drop, it might be a bit of a rethink on that. Interestingly enough, again, those 2 litre per 100 kilometres cars haven't quite made it to Canberra yet, or indeed Australia in general. That's a quick observation. And certainly, behaviourally, obviously, the price of gasoline is too cheap because the speed limit signs around Canberra, to me, seem sort of advisory, really, rather than obligatory. Maybe I'm just getting old or something. Okay, and I mean, a final point, just to reinforce this about policy, we do this work because we want to say to decision makers, you can change the world. I've spent a lot of time working in government, 36 years, give or take a few months. Policies can and do make a difference. I'd love to see this forecast not achieved. I would love to see governments doing a lot. I should have thrown in there a comment about renewables, which are going quite well as well, and we've seen good policy interventions getting effective results. A little point about energy price. Oh, sorry, I better talk about demand first. That'll be good. So, looking globally, what's happened? We've seen a steep ramp up in Chinese demand, pretty obvious here. Rest of the world still growing quite steadily. OECD, obviously a recession's taken the top off energy demand there. We look ahead, we say OECD demand flat, as I've already said. We have oil demand falling, we have coal demand falling, we have gas demand rising, and we have renewables going up as well. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail. China, a bit more interesting, still a lot of growth, and these, this y-axis here is 1,000 million tonne oil equivalent. These are big numbers. So we have China growing for about the next 10 years, but then starting to plateau in energy use around about 2030. And that's important. And of course, finally, we see India, well, the rest of the world, but particularly India, taking over and India, of course, has much lower per capita energy use than any of the countries we're talking about here. And indeed, post-2025 or thereabouts, India takes over as the leader of global growth, India and ASEAN countries. So, just talking a little bit about energy costs. Everyone's talking about how expensive electricity is in Australia, and there's some special factors there, but not really on the Jake Malone here. If we go back to 2008, before the recession, we can see that Japan and Europe were both expensive places to do business, US less so, China and India cheaper again. Currently, we see that both Europe and Japan, already expensive countries, have become more expensive, but the US cheaper, and that's a direct reflection of the falling costs of gas. Gas at the $4 that Professor Chu was talking about, equivalent to $25 per barrel of oil. That's cheap energy by anyone's standards. And when it goes into nice combined cycle gas plant. It's nice, efficient. You get good impacts on electricity prices as well. China and India remaining cheap. And we look over the forecast period, we see a couple of interesting things happening. The US, we see a little bit of an increase in gas prices, but we see them maintaining a very large and durable advantage over other OECD countries. And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing energy-intensive industries relocating or re-emphasising back into the Gulf of Mexico where they can get cheap gas and cheap ethane. Ethane almost gets given away in the US these days. But interestingly enough, China and India see higher energy costs. And China is moving to a more modern energy grid, one where electricity takes a bigger place, where gas takes a bigger place, and where lower cost coal relatively falls back. So IEA ministers are quite concerned about the costs of energy. Environmental impact is certainly important in their thinking, but whenever they get together, Professor Chu can talk about this, he was there in 2011, and whenever they get together, they talk about affordability. So, turning quickly to oil, as I said before, OECD oil demand actually falls over the projection period, some 10 million barrels a day. Currently, OECD and non-OECD roughly the same, but we see around a 50% growth in oil demand in non-OECD countries. So what that means is, in net terms, we have an increase 2040 of about 14 million barrels from the current level of about 90, which is quite a bit lower than what we had foreseen in previous years. That's got something to do with the fact we've got $100 oil, at least we had $100 oil up to recently. We are seeing some demand side impacts. How are we going to meet that? Well, the first thing to point out is we look at the rest of the world, apart from US, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, major producers, net decline in output from most producers. Net decline. We look at the United States and we continue to see small, and we've already seen more than 4 million barrels a day. We continue to see that increasing up until around about 2020 by another 2.5 million barrels. But after that, we see growth begin to taper, and by about 2030, we're actually starting to see that taper off. Still a very considerable increase in US oil output, but incremental gains are relatively muted. I might add, because combined with this increased production plus that 4 million barrel per day decline in demand means a massive change in US oil imports and with enormous implications for trade and security. The second area comes from Canada, where we continue to see an increase in largely unconventional oil, tar sands oil. The third increase from deep water Brazil, and finally the Middle East. Now, this is all well and good. You can see here in 2020 we have an increasing reliance on Middle Eastern oil for incremental supply. And 2020 is the day after tomorrow if you're talking investment. So already we see a problem here, that Middle Eastern crude supply, in the absence of investment, will not be forthcoming. So looking ahead and trying to preempt perhaps a few questions that people might ask, certainly buoyant supply growth in North America has brought prices down. Can it keep them down? Well, one of the interesting things that we have seen is a very marked increase in the productivity of North American unconventional gas and oil. Less so in oil because the price incentive hasn't been there, but in the case of gas, the prices have collapsed, put very severe pressure on production. We've seen tremendous increases in productivity. You've just got to go to the Energy Information Administration's website and to see some of those, and I've actually included one of them in the spare slide. So obviously this morning with prices at $60, the world's going to be a different place. Upstream spending plans, particularly the big projects, if you're going to be building a Gorgon type development, you're going to be really redoing your numbers. Numbers that work at 100 or even at 80 are not going to work at 60, and believe me, directors are going to start asking the people who are putting these studies together to sharpen their pencil pretty much. High cost areas, North America, and when I say North America, that's both US unconventional and conventional supplies, offshore, Gulf of Mexico, unconventional in Canada, and offshore in Brazil. Squeezed cash flow will obviously have an impact. Petrobras needs to borrow a lot of money to make that Brazilian production work. It'll need to borrow more money if it's only getting $60. Yeah. I did this draft presentation a few weeks ago, as Ken will, and I was about to change it yesterday and I thought, oh, bugger it. I mean, I could wake up in the morning, it could be 80 again anyway, so let's leave it at 80. Again, obviously, everyone who uses oil, everybody from Qantas to the everyday motorist is better off, although again it's not showing in Qantas's air conditioning performance. But that will boost demand. It'll boost GDP, but also boost demand. It will lessen conservation efforts. It does provide, I should say, an opportunity for those countries where subsidies are present, and some of those countries like Nigeria or Egypt or Indonesia can't afford them. Some of them can, some of them can't. But even in Middle Eastern countries where they're very high, low oil prices give an opportunity and a driving force to lower those subsidies. So there might be some good news there. But it will also accelerate dependence on the Middle East. And I don't think I need to labour the point on what that means for both strategic and, well, security issues and affordability issues. I might add, in the longer term, our view remains that, as with Professor Chu, we don't see oil prices staying at 60 for a prolonged period. In the medium to longer term, we see them trending higher. So, to talk global power markets, and just a quick introduction, just to wake everybody up. So, 2040, how much bigger will the Chinese power market be compared to Australia? Any hands up for 10 times the size? 30 times the size? 30? 30 times the size? 60 times the size? 60? 100 times? Okay, about half the audience are obviously still asleep with their hands down. Give it a try, folks. Okay, the answer is about 50 times bigger. So when I put this slide up, just keep that in mind. You know, if we put Australia here, you wouldn't really see it. I get a couple of important things to highlight here. Firstly, this is one of the few graphs where I'll actually give you a range between the three scenarios. It just gets too confusing otherwise. The central policy scenario, as I said, new policy scenario. But I've given you a range here and indicates that even in a 450 scenario, electricity growth is still very strong. Okay, a little bit more subdued in China. In the current policies, a bit more, but that's a surprisingly insensitive result. I think we're all a bit surprised by that. It comes down to the fact that electricity is penetrating. People want more electricity. The things that give you quality of life are electricity, and electricity is a more efficient way to do business even in a lot of industries. So in the case of, we've got China, you can see China and India there. India's growth we anticipate to be spectacular, 3,000 terawatt hours. I said China heading up towards 10,000 terawatt hours, Australia 200 terawatt hours. OECD Europe, very low growth, only about 0.5% per annum, maybe even a bit less, I think. America's moderate growth. Okay, second important story here is what happens over the future, and as I foreshadowed earlier, renewables overtakes coal by about 2035, give or take a year or two. Oil pretty much disappears from the power sector. Places like Hawaii, sadly, are still going to probably be burning oil in 2040, and maybe Tasmania, I shouldn't make Tasmanian jokes for that. Isolated places will be burning oil, maybe. Nuclear, and I'll come back to nuclear in a moment, nuclear we have growing by about 60% in our base case. A few people this morning thought that was a bit optimistic. We'll talk about that in a moment. But of course, it only just all that does is maintain market share. Gas, we have a big growth in gas, obviously as the preferred balancing fuel for renewables, intermittent renewables, and particularly gas because relatively low capital cost and high operating flexibility. Two issues which nuclear certainly doesn't have, and coal has sort of, and indeed in Europe we've seen a bit of that, and I'll come to that. So renewables, we've got some big numbers here for renewables, but basically half the incremental growth in electricity globally comes from renewables. So that's where we stand now, and of course there's a couple of people made this morning, the point this morning, that when we talk about renewables, currently hydro is by far the biggest share of it. You can see here nearly 4,000 terawatt hours of hydro, and under 1,000 for what I call wind, modern renewables, wind and solar. What we see there is that over the forecast period, hydro grows but just maintains its market share. But because the unconventional, we have massive growth. In the case of solar, we have a factor of 14 times, 1,400%. For wind, it is 6 times. So these are massive increases. We've taken into account we've continued a modest decline in photovoltaic costs. Certainly if we were to see a much bigger price drop, then we could see even bigger penetrations. I might add in the 450 scenario, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, solar has to increase 20 times from the 14 times we have here, 20 times, and for wind, a factor of 10 to make 450 happen. Now, they're already big numbers. I just say to proponents of renewables, if you want to try and do this without some of the other things we're talking about here, without efficiency, without nuclear, those are already very, very big numbers. I'm not saying they're impossible, but they are very, very big numbers. A very large share of the investment in the power sector at the moment is going into photovoltaics. No surprise there. I think roughly of the order of a quarter. Subsidies are a fact of life in renewables, and I'm not going to defend them, only to say that in Europe, where about half of these subsidies are, around about $70 billion per annum, and the majority of that comes from 3 countries, Germany, Spain and Italy. Certainly in Spain, the cost of those subsidies for consumers, and bear in mind not all consumers pay those subsidies. Quite a few categories of particularly large energy users are sheltered from paying those costs. They're getting very hard to bear. In Spain, they've been restructured already. We continue to see the need for subsidies. We're hopeful that by the final decade of the forecast period, those subsidies can start to drop, as some of the subsidies we currently have now, which are a 20-year lifetime, start to be grandfathered out of the system. So who's going to do this? And obviously China is a very important player here. And again, I heard on the radio last week, and it was a quote from last week's conference, that China will be building 1,000 terawatt hours of renewables in the next decade, and indeed that's pretty close to where we are. You can see here 2,000 terawatt hours over the forecast period. That's 10 times current Australia. So they'll build 10 Australias in the next 20 to 25 years. Out there, pretty big bar. European Union, again 1,000 terawatt hours. US, India, the big 4 countries. I'll come back to that, and you can see the breakup there to one side. Wind is, as it is everywhere, wind is the major contributor. Conventional hydro in China, not so much available to the EU or indeed US or other OECD countries. Right, turning quickly to nuclear. As I said, our base case forecast 60% increase in actual generation. EU going backwards, of course. Lots of things happening there. Germany already started to phase out its nuclear, closed down 8 gigawatts already, and with more to come. Switzerland, not part of the EU, but they'll go the same way. Belgium as well. In fact, Belgium, Professor Coale was talking about Britain having low capacity. Belgium's just lost a couple of nuclear reactors unexpectedly, and they've got a real capacity issue as we speak. Japan, a bit of a question mark. We don't quite know what's happening there. They have 1 reactor that is now licensed to come on stream. It hasn't started yet, so as of now they have no nuclear power, but of course they do have a very large import bill for oil and gas. US, modest improvements, modest increase only. There are 5 reactors being built, I think, in the US as we speak. One of them, Watts Bar, I was lucky enough to be in Tennessee in 1982 when Watts Bar started to be built. It's going to be finished finally, which is good, 35 years after the event. The other 4 are being built in effectively highly regulated areas, which raises a very interesting point about how can you finance a nuclear reactor in a liberalised power environment. That was touched on a bit this morning. Very, very difficult to any large-scale, long-lived capital asset. If it's a Tiddlywinks factory, it's tough to get investment in OECD countries, but a nuclear reactor with its very long construction period, uncertain and high construction costs, okay, low operating costs and certain operating costs, but very tough to get it up. Again, the US government's played an important role there, as is the UK government with Hinkley B. Russia and India are important, but of course China is the key to all that. We've got 130 gigawatts, and that's an impressive number. That'll generate, about 800 terawatt hours of power. So again, that's about 4 Australias being built over the forecast period. I might add to the point we've made there, over the course of since 1971, if we take it up to 2040, the nuclear fleet has avoided 4 years of global CO2 emissions. A very important contributor to ongoing global CO2 efforts. I might add we modelled a low nuclear case. In fact, we modelled a number of cases. A low nuclear case, which is a flat line more or less, and we just looked at the impact on a number of major economies, Japan, Korea and the EU, and of course all of them have very significant increases in cost of their coal and gas imports. All of them have very significant increases in emissions. In the case of Japan, 35%, Korea 26%, the EU 20%. That's just with a flat nuclear scenario. And of course, gas and coal trade both grow very significantly, which is good news if you're selling coal and gas. So what are the problems? Well, I think we've covered them pretty significantly, but first point to note is that the EU in particular is facing a very large amount of retirements as we currently anticipate. Now, the United States has shown the way forward in terms of the old joke about, I've had this axe in my family for 3 generations. My father replaced the head and I've replaced the handle twice, but it's been in a family 3 generations. Applies to a lot of the US nuclear plant because they have very successfully reworked steam generators, got more efficiency out of the reactors, which were, when they were built very conservatively, relatively low thermodynamic efficiency, and that's improved. But if the EU does not extend lifetimes, and of course in the current circumstances, and even the French are talking about lowering from 75 down to 50% of their power, you're not going to get a new reactor built in Europe. And the issue of decommissioning, in the next, over the forecast period, we see something like 200 reactors being decommissioned. Large-scale decommissioning on that scale has not been done. So our estimate, which was quoted this morning, is a little heroic, but it's there and it's a real issue. The second issue is radioactive waste. Currently we have that amount of spent nuclear fuel, 350,000 tonnes. It's not a big amount, but we have precisely no long-term repositories. The Finns are talking about it, as well they should. The Swedes the same, the French the same. Quite advanced discussions, and both the Swedes and the Finns and the French are quite serious about it. I was out in the Aude, which is a region to the east of Paris, and normally when you're in a little country town like that, Saturday morning you get harassed by beggars and thieves and pickpockets and whatever. But there I got harassed by the anti-nuclear repository people. I've got some very colourful banners which I could have reproduced, but I'll avoid that. Over the forecast period we see that doubling. You can see the rough graphic there. All of those countries will have significant quantities of waste, which they currently do not have a waste repository. Right, turning to the big 4 power markets and what does all this mean? I've got 4 very similar slides showing the projections. They may look similar, but I inveigle you to look at the y-axis because the y-axis is quite different for all the 4 of them. Let's start with the US, and it's worth spending a little bit of time on this one. The black line here is the CO2 intensity, and then we've got coal, gas, oil and nuclear going up. First thing to note is that you can see US coal use peaked in about 2005 and has been declining ever since, with a very sharp decline in 2012 with that cheap gas. A little bit of a rebound since, but that's part of the reason why the US has got such an improved greenhouse gas performance. Oil pretty much disappeared. Gas growing very quickly. Gas will be the number 1 power fuel by about 2025, I guess, thereabouts. Renewables, obviously, a large portion of the incremental growth. Again, as Professor Chu pointed out, mandates in pretty much 80% of the US economy, driving that and driving it very successfully and driving costs down, I might add as well. Notwithstanding that, we've got something like 1.6 trillion required, in investment to make that happen. It's not straightforward. Okay, China. Again, you can see Chinese, let's start with Chinese coal. And of course, people ask us all the time to say, when's Chinese coal going to peak? Peak. I love that peak, metaphor peak. That's a peak, isn't it? Well, actually, let's try it more like that. That's a peak. Well, as you can see there, when you look at Chinese coal-fired power, it doesn't look much like a peak. Yes, it's plateauing, and by about 2030, we'll start to see much more efficient plant coming into the mix, replacing some of the old plant. But certainly the growth in coal-fired power from about, not quite 4,000 terawatt hours we've got there to about 5,500 terawatt hours continues right through the forecast period. Notwithstanding the massive diversification that we're seeing, even with that growth, coal drops from 75 to about 52% of Chinese coal, so Chinese power. So combination of gas and nuclear, but especially renewables, is very important to China, as I pointed out, and there's no doubt the Chinese are very serious about making that happen. To make that happen, by the way, is approximately $4.5 trillion of investment. Okay, India, again, growth, and again, relatively similar picture in the sense of coal currently about 70%, falling to about 55% of power, but still increasing in absolute terms dramatically. As you can see here, we've got India going up to 3,500 terawatt hours. Per capita use will still be very low, certainly compared to OECD and even current Chinese standards. They would be, at the end of that forecast period, per capita use still below where China is now. Okay, different economic model, lots of different things happening, but still highlights the fact that there's potential, a lot of potential here for growth and hopefully potential for energy efficiency as well. And one last slide, the EU. You can see, of course, coal falling dramatically, probably by about half. Coal use peaked way back in the 90s in the EU. Gas made a big impact, but obviously gas is becoming a little bit unfashionable now. Nuclear still holds its own. That's a questionable assumption, just declined slightly, but of course renewables is the big story. Renewables in the EU have been 80% of the investment over the last decade, and that pattern continues pretty much through the forecast period. One particular problem we have in the EU, and again Professor Chu highlighted how some of these countries have very high shares of renewable penetration, is that to get, let's say, 25% in Spain, in 2013, the peak wind solar was 70%. It was Boxing Day 2013. A couple of months before it was zero. So you've got a very wide part of deliverability. The way the Spanish manage that, again, as Professor Chu pointed out, they are an island. Well, obviously not if you've travelled from say, Perpignan to Barcelona, but in energy terms they are. They have a very nice modern fleet of gas-fired power plants, which are technically engineering, terrific, economic disasters. Which brings me to the second point, which is that Europe in general has a lot of retiring capacity, and it will need some kind of backup generation to back up these increasing shares as this ramps up. Yes, there are other ways of managing this demand, transmission, as does Denmark, demand side issues, and storage, of course. But in practical terms, that's where Europe has gone. And at the IEA, we are certainly worried about the investment case. Certainly for nuclear, it's very hard, but even for any conventional fossil plant. So enough of that. Let's switch to gas and coal. And again, China's the story. China back in 2005 was, as a gas consumer, was about the same size as France. Pretty small, about 50 BCM. Last year, it was number 3 gas user globally. It increased by, tripled in fact, over less than the last decade. We continue to see that growth coming. I might add that even at those levels, being the 3rd largest consumer, gas is only about 4% of their energy demand. Typical OECD country gas is 20. So there's a big upside for gas, and you can see here on the top Chinese power, but not just power, but industry as well, getting out of coal, getting into more modern energy technologies and energy forms. The US, of course, I think we've spoken a lot about that, but if you look at a state like Pennsylvania, which 5 years ago had no gas production, if Pennsylvania was a gas-producing country, it would be the 3rd biggest in the world now. It's 150 BCM. Right, gas security is back on the agenda. Certainly, if you come from Europe, that's all people are talking about at the moment. But there's some good news here that the number of supplies is set to rise very rapidly. The number of liquefaction plants, currently around about 25, we see it rising to approximately 70 by the end of the forecast period. And obviously Australia growing in importance, those 7 LNG plants, the first should come on pretty soon. But bar immediately above it, US and Canada, definitely the next big lick of supply, no question there. And what makes it interesting is the business model, certainly for the first 4 of those plants that have been approved, is based on a US gas price index and takes the liquefaction plant out of the indexation. So it actually raises the possibility that this gas will behave more in a merchant way, in a more flexible and market-oriented way compared to the current gas model and rigid oil indexation. I can talk a bit more about that if you're interested. It's a very important development. You can also see, of course, that gas LNG trade is going to double. And that's very important, just the absolute increase. And of course, inter-regional gas trade, pipeline trade will also increase during that time. Problem is, however, that all of that trade is going to be expensive. So LNG is expensive. There's no way around it. One of the politicians I work for, I probably shouldn't tell you this story, but he asked me, why is LNG so expensive? Can't we make it cheaper? And I said, well, Minister, it all comes down to the second law of thermodynamics, which I think is a reasonable explanation. To which he said, well, we've got the numbers in the Senate now, we can repeal that. Secretary Chu was talking about communicating with politicians last night, and anyway, ministerial staff meant to be a bit more discreet than that, but anyway. So just talking about, gas imports, China, again, the saga of most interest, but now we have a deal with Russia, and we see those imports increasing very rapidly. So some of their imports will come by pipeline, some already does from Turkmenistan. Ashgabat, very interesting place if you get the chance to visit. Not a place I want to go back to in a hurry, and I certainly wouldn't leave your key in the computer when you go to Ashgabat either, because you get some very interesting viruses. Anyway, I digress completely. So we have Chinese imports, very large, 250 BCM. Current Australian, just to put it in context, current Australian exports about 30 BCM of LNG. That's a mixture of pipeline gas and LNG. And of course China, that gives China the opportunity, along with its own production, and bear in mind we had something like 600 BCM for demand, so Chinese production's got to expand as well. And that's a big wild card here because some of that's going to have to be unconventional, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So we have the opportunity in China to create something like a trading hub of the sort that we've seen evolve in Europe. Obviously the US has one, the UK has one, the sort that we've seen evolve in the US. One of the key things the IEA has been working on with the China, well, we've been working on a lot of things with the Chinese, but how we get better gas pricing and gas trading, because they're very interested. Right, turning to coal. So as I said before, we've seen this massive increase in coal use in the last 12 years. Roughly half of global incremental energy in the last decade came from coal, roughly. We see that flattening off, but we don't see it peaking by any means. That's a plateau by anyone's imagination. So Europe, traditional coal user, peaked 25 years ago and continues to fall right through the forecast period by about half. US peaked a decade ago and again continues to fall. We've factored in the new policies announced by the administration. US steaming coal use falls by 1/3 over the forecast period, from 50% its peak, more than 50% of US power in 2005. China, the elephant in the room, and again peak. So somebody asked me, first speech I did a few days after WEO, so Chinese coal demand peaks in 2030. Yeah, I suppose, if you look at it sideways. The point I'm trying to make here is, yes, it flattens out, but this is still a very big number. It's 3,000 million tonne coal equivalent, physical terms in excess of 4.5 billion tonnes. It's a very big number. Coal's not going anywhere soon. I might add that that's even taking into account the fact we're pretty certain that Chinese steel production will peak quite soon, before 2020, along with cement. And again, when I say peak, it doesn't go, it only falls a very small amount. So India, by the way, India becomes the second largest coal consumer before the end of this decade, passing in the United States. You can see here more than 1 billion tonnes of coal consumed in India, and by a lot of that will have to be imports because the power stations that will use it are built on the sea to take imported coal. Indian coal has a lot of issues, not the least being a high ash content. Some of that's just due to bad policies, which could be fixed. So we're very interested to work with the new Modi government on investigating some of those issues. But overall, that's the story with coal. It's big, it's going to be around for a long time, and that one graph should convince you that we need to do something to mitigate the environmental impact of coal. And that means we've got to use coal much, much more efficiently, starting today. Yesterday or 10 years ago would have been better, but certainly starting right now, and obviously in the longer term, mitigating the emissions. And that means the group of technologies we loosely call CCS. Okay, I think we've covered this pretty clearly. Asian power sector is driving coal demand, but you can see that growth begins to drop, and then drop dramatically post-2020. And in the case of industry, as I said, we've got Chinese steel production peaking before 2020, about 17, 18, and then minor declines thereafter, and they are only minor. Coal trade grows by around about 40% over the forecast period. That's a result a few of my colleagues find hard to believe in Europe, but again, Asia's the issue here. We have China emerged as that same chap who questioned me about my forecast back in China in 2005 said, how can you forecast that China is going to import coal? We're one of the biggest coal exporters, you're just Australian, just trying to convince us that, you know, you don't want to invest, you don't want more competition. And I said, no, I'm very confident that China will be importing coal by 2010 or soon after, and indeed by 2012 China has emerged as the world's largest coal importer, and it remains a large importer right through the forecast period. It's a niche product. You might say 250 odd million tonnes, 300 million tonnes, which is what we're talking there is a big niche, but it's only 7 or 8% of Chinese coal, and it's just basically driven by geography. India, of course, emerges as the world's biggest importer around about the mid-20s. Right? And of course, Europe's still there. It doesn't disappear because Europe's own coal use does fall away, but so does its own production. So, investment, my last topic. You've been patient. A couple of sort of general themes, because we can probably talk about this a bit more. But the general theme in terms of investment is you've got to run hard just to stand still in the investment world. And that's true, certainly true in the power sector, because we see retirements. Now, a lot of these retirements, we're talking about aged coal capacity in Australia, and that's true. The last decent power station, there's only been a couple built, one or two in the 90s, one or two in the 2000s. If we go to Britain, most recent coal station was built in 1984, give or take a year. So a lot of this plant is going to be retired, particularly in Europe, and Europe's got to make some decisions about either replacing it with renewables or somehow putting a business case together for gas, coal or nuclear. And it's going to be really, really tough, particularly when you've got that amount of additions. So you can see, of course, that while the absolute increase is pretty impressive just from there to there, in fact it's worse than that because of all these retirements. Now, yes, you can lifetime extend and do all kinds of things, but in practical terms, you know, that's a big investment challenge. Second thing just concerns coal mining, and again, people talk a lot about stranded assets. You can see here that there's the top line is the coal demand curve there, and we do it this way. You can see that we need both brownfield and greenfield mines. After 2020, coal from existing mines drops off very, very quickly. So it tells you that the risk of stranded investment on coal is actually pretty low. Investment in the power sector is by far the biggest sector for investment, and clearly China in the next 10 years or thereabouts remains a major focus. But towards the end of that period, in the second half of the forecast period, we continue to see that drop away. The rest of the world then takes over, particularly India, Southeast Asia. But of course, OECD countries, even though they have practically no growth, are still investing to decarbonise and to replace retiring capacity. And their investment needs are very substantial, as you can see, even though growth is almost non-existent. A final point about investment. It's the new policies investment world, and $40-odd trillion. It's $1 trillion. It sounds a lot of money, but when you stretch over 25 years across the planet, isn't that much. Fossil fuel, power transmission development, low carbon investment in a 450 world. Energy efficiency in a 450 world, we need to do a lot more. We need a lot more on low carbon investment. We need to do much, much more on energy efficiency. So already, hopefully a couple of messages that I've made. We do need to spend more money, but a lot of that money is on energy efficiency, and if we do it right, of course, we actually do it cost effectively and save money. Car that uses 2 litres per 100 kilometres, trust me, is a lot cheaper to fill up at the pump. So, just a few thoughts on investment. Obviously, governments are involved in energy markets, and that does create the question of political and regulatory risk. A couple of comments here about changes in Australian government policy. You're not on Jake Malone. There have been a few other countries who have changed policies recently, and in a world where we are investing high capital intensity, high upfront costs, then this makes life very, very tough. Our Clean Energy Finance Corporation, there is definitely a market niche here for greater activity in the task of securing finance. Europe in particular is proving extremely difficult. Okay, this is a controversial comment. I'm happy to discuss it further, but the issue comes down to managing variable renewables, and given all these retirements that Europe has in the next 10 years, that creates a very difficult case unless they can get much more investment in transmission, demand-side responses and storage technologies, none of which we're seeing at the moment. Okay, gas is growing, and unconventional gas we anticipate growing in a number of areas, spreading from North America to Australia and to China and even to Argentina, but oil remains a big problem. And obviously, I don't have to labour this point after what we've said today, credible policy and pricing signals, and that means they have to be long-term, but they've got to be credible. And by credible, if you're Spain, for example, and you have a scheme that's giving €10 billion of subsidies for renewables, that sadly is not credible. It's simply not sustainable in the long run. So you have to come up with something a bit smarter. So, to finish, 2 degrees C. I think it was Professor Lowe who quoted this. That's how much we've emitted, since 1900, and basically our budget for 2 degrees world, for 450 degree world, is 2,300 gigatons, and we anticipate that on new policy settings will be completely emitted by 2040. And of course, by 2040, we won't magically stop emitting greenhouse gas emissions. They'll continue at, as you've seen, at a relatively high rate, which tells you that given the longevity of the systems we're talking about, we need to start tomorrow. Yesterday would have been good, 2010 would have been better, and certainly 2015 is really getting a bit too late. That's 2013, that's the low carbon investment budget. Renewables doing quite well, a bit on efficiency. Our central scenario, so-called new policy scenario, we need to triple our investment on efficiency. Renewables, as I said, are actually doing pretty well. We talked a lot about renewable deployment. Costs are coming down. People have mandates in place, are relatively comfortable, but renewables can't do it all by itself. And our 450 scenario, that's how much we need. So we're a factor of, I'll be polite, at least 4 away from the necessary investment. And of course, that should be one of the key themes for the next session. How do we get that investment in energy efficiency? It's tough, and particularly when the price of oil has dropped to 60 and everyone's suddenly forgotten about 2 litres per 100 kilometres. So, just to conclude, well, market uncertainties, $60 oil has certainly underlined that. Energy security, oil and gas security will remain tough issues. Gas is moving in the right direction. Oil is a much bigger question mark against it, particularly investment in the Middle East. I mean, who's going to invest in Iraq or Libya? Ironically, both of those countries have kept oil supplies up right through terrible civil wars. The situation in Libya, we were briefed on this last month. There's a civil war, there are 2 factions, and they both live in the oil ministry. The oil minister from one lives on the top floor, and the oil minister from the eastern province lives on the floor below him, and they both sign all the checks. And it seems to be working just fine, I guess. So if you're happy with that, as secure oil supply, well, good. Nuclear power, we've talked a fair bit about it. We haven't underlined the fact that it is a secure energy source. It's stably priced. France has amongst the cheapest electricity in Europe as we speak. The people in Finland who invested in it, it was a collection of companies. They did it because they wanted stable, secure energy. The alternative for them is Russia. And as one of them said to me, we've only fought 2 or 3 wars in the last 100 years with Russia, so we're on pretty good terms. But I've talked about the drawbacks. There are advantages, as I mentioned, public concerns, decommissioning, waste, and of course financing. Again, Professor Coale talked about this earlier. Don't need to labour it. We've already seen some 2 very impressive policy commitments by the 2 biggest emitters, by both China and the United States. On our current projections, they are both very important commitments, and they'll be both difficult to achieve. I notice the Republicans are busy bad-mouthing them, as is the Telegraph. Well, fine and good, but certainly from the viewpoint of the IEA, these are very important commitments, and we'll need a lot more if Paris is to be a success. Yeah, I don't think I need to add further. With the indulgence of the chair, I'll have one last quiz because I got inspired by Professor Chu last week. You might wonder why our World Energy Outlook features Africa, because that's our special subject. A quarter of the book I actually didn't even talk about, which is sub-Saharan Africa, but I'll just give you a teaser. So I do want to see everyone's hands up this time. Ethiopia, 84 million people, has the power consumption of how many Australians on the basis of average per capita use? Now, no reaching for the tablets. I know it's a bit of math, but okay, we've got 4 options. 100,000, come on. 2 million, so Australians use 40 times the per capita use. How many? 2 million? 1 million? 1 million? That's 80. Okay, 80 times 300,000. 80,000. A few 80s. Okay, pretty much the population of Canberra, 300,000. 84 million Ethiopians, about 3.5 terawatt hours. Dismal, pathetic. You can use whatever word you like. This is a very poor region. I could talk forever about that, but I won't, because Ken will bloody strangle me with his tie, the way he's waving it too. So I'll take questions at that point.